Today I want to honor all the men and women who have served and also those who did not return. So we want to say a little prayer for them right now. So let's pray. In our community are people who have given all, and some who have been willing to give all who have come home. We send our love and our blessing to them, that we have been able to be afforded to be safe, to be free, and to prosper. For all of that they have given to us, we say thank you. And may there be a blessing upon them, their families, and all of this country for their efforts. And so it is. Amen. So now, I want to tell you a little, in preparing for today, I watched, I think he was an admiral. He was giving an address to the University of Texas, a Navy SEAL. He'd been a Navy SEAL his whole military career. And he talked about his training to become a Navy SEAL, that this 6 or 8 or 10 or how many weeks it was, that they went through special training where they were put to the test, and many people dropped out. And to drop out, all you had to do was go into the little square around where they were training and ring the bell, and then you were free. And you were often encouraged to drop out because you were such a loser and nothing was working for you and you were so weak, and etc. And they had to be really, really strong to get through it. Internally, they had to be physically they had to be in the top few percent, but internally they had to be equally as strong. And I was listening to this and I was going, so when I was a young man and about this guy's age, when he was going through training, I thought, yeah, I could probably do that. Yeah, I could do that. I could do that. But I got to this one thing which really took me back, and I went, I'm not sure I could do that. Or I certainly know I'd have to have the right attitude to be able to do this. And that was, they would have to stand for inspection, which meant they had to come with their uniform perfect, their belt buckle polished, everything ironed and pressed, and they would stand there at attention, and to the best of these very competent people's ability, they had dressed themselves, and then they were told they had missed something. And if they were chosen that day to have missed something, they were told to go into the ocean fully dressed, and then come out and roll around on the sand. And what this speaker was saying was, it didn't matter how perfect you were, they would find something. They always found something when they wanted to. They found something and they would make you do this as though you had completely failed. And you had to wear this uniform all day long. Cold, wet uniform with sand on it all day long. And I thought, I am such a whiner. I do something and they don't like it. I do something 80% right or 90 or even 100, what I think is 100% right, and someone doesn't appreciate it and I whine about it. Do you know what I mean? I'd be ringing that bell, I'm out of here. It's like such a whiner. And I realized that this is a real problem for me, is that if I'm not acknowledged, I fall apart, right? I mean, it's not by everybody. Everybody doesn't have to come up to me and tell me what a great guy I am. But if I just, this self-acclamation of I've done the best and it didn't work out and yet I'm still okay, has not been one that's been inside me, right? If it didn't work out, I don't feel okay. I let my outsides tell my insides who I'm supposed to be, right? And so I thought, how heroic these guys are. They are training to be warriors. He said, he described what he thought was the hardest thing, which was swimming 2 miles at night to practice placing demolition underneath the center of a ship parked in harbor, and how it would be a little bit of light as you're diving along, and then you'd have to go under the ship, and then it would get completely black, and the noise would be very deafening from just being next to the machinery at that level of the ship and all of that. And I thought, yeah, but this thing about not being, like... And I realized that for me, and I think for most of us, actually our biggest battles are internal. They're not really the external world. So I was watching the Dalai Lama, and I was trying to get my head around this phrase that Jesus had said, love your enemies and pray for them. And we've heard this, almost all of us have heard this our whole lives, love your enemies and pray for them. But on a daily basis, I must say I'm not very active in that teaching. And so I thought the Dalai Lama would be a perfect one to ask about this, right? So I was reading a book of talks he had done, and looking on the YouTubes, and he said, to everyone wants to be happy. And I got that. Yeah, want to be happy, right? But to be happy, he says, you need physical support. You need your body, your circumstances need to be good, and that will get you somewhere. But most importantly is you have to have the right mind. That the mind, if it's in the right way, can even overcome some of the physical discomfort or even some pain. So, but if, on the other hand, everything's working and your mind's messed up, you're miserable. And to become happy, you have to develop compassion. Well, I know the Dalai Lama's story, as many of you do. The Dalai Lama is the leader, spiritually and politically, of the nation of Tibet. And at age 14, he was driven out of Tibet by the Chinese, fleeing for his life. Goes to India. He's been the leader in exile. In his own country of Tibet, if you are carrying a picture of his, you can be arrested and suffer greatly. If you mention his name, even as a foreigner, you could be in big trouble. China has come in, and with as much force as they could bear, it seems, they have done their best to get rid of the Tibetan culture, which, in my opinion, was one of the most spiritual cultures in the world. And yet they call him a criminal, the Chinese. And they say if you are in contact with his community, you could go to jail, you could die. And that if you're promoting this religion, which is somehow false, you can be tortured. And so the monasteries have been desecrated and some of them torn down. And they have done their best to strip Tibet of Tibet and replace it with Chinese. They're not the only country that's ever done it, but they're the ones right now doing it. In the face of this, the Dalai Lama can break out into laughter almost any time. These are his people, his charge, his friends, and yet he knows happiness. And he says he knows happiness because he knows compassion for the Chinese. Now, he says that most people, almost everybody has friends. Everybody has friends. Everybody has somebody they love. They have a benefactor that it's easy for them to be kind and appreciative to. But some of us have special friends, he calls them. Now, he doesn't blame the Chinese people, but the Chinese government. He says, these are my special friends. These are the people who are forcing me to transform myself so that in the pursuit of being happy, I can keep compassion for them as well. And so I'm developing myself through their special friendship. And I thought, compassion, when I hear the word compassion, I'm thinking of, I'm doing better than you are, and I feel sorry for you, right? That's kind of a compassion for you. But the Dalai Lama said, compassion really comes from the core of who we are, that we all want to be happy, and that we're all sentient beings in some way, and we all know we want to be happy. And I could add to that, it turns out that we all are from the same DNA strand somewhere. I mean, it's branched quite a bit, but we're all from the same DNA strand. I mean, the ant and you and me, and even more so, human beings hardly vary at all between each other as far as the percentage of DNA that's different. We're all one family. I mean, every living thing is from one family of DNA that has branched and become different. So we have that. We share the same air, the same water, same sunlight. And so, when Jesus says you should love your neighbor, you should love your enemy, and pray for them, the next sentences is basically saying, be like the sun that shines on the good and the evil as well. We all have to share the same. It's like the DNA is shared, the sunlight is shared. We're all in this together, whether we can feel it at the moment or not. And so the Dalai Lama then says, there's one more piece to this. When this started to make sense to me after a couple of days of thinking about it, he said, when you suffer persecution like this, when you suffer, you're coming to the end of your suffering. Your karma is coming to the end. So one of the things that's very big in Tibetan society is this idea of karma. So basically, karma means that whatever you plant, you will reap. And if it's not in this lifetime, in another lifetime. But no matter what happens, the law of cause and effect follows you all the way through your existence. So do good and good comes to you. Do bad and bad comes to you. You will suffer if you cause others to suffer, etc. And so he says, we're at the end of our karma, but they're just at the beginning. Now, that could be a snide remark, but coming from him, he basically was saying, I see that they will be paying, this price is going to be paid by them. They're going to pay for it. And so I have compassion for their suffering. Maybe not present at this moment, but it will happen. And I think one of the things that's true about all of us is that we suffer, and we not only want to be happy, but we don't want to suffer. We really don't like it. And so when we realize the feelings, the sensation, the experience, the suffering that comes from suffering, it's easier to have compassion for someone who's building a bad trail of karma for themselves. And so he has this capacity to see the Chinese leadership of the Chinese, as calling forth a deeper level of understanding and oneness and compassion for them, even though they look differently. Now, I would think that it would also take a degree of forgiveness. And forgiveness now doesn't mean you condone it, and neither does compassion mean you condone it. It doesn't mean you don't do your best to not have it happen to you. It doesn't mean that you lay down and roll over. And so in some ways, on a Memorial Day, it's good to remember that sometimes you actually have to take up the fight. But what I would like to talk today about is the problem we have in this country that is being exploited by the media, by the politicians, to bring out the worst in us. And so this fight is an internal fight more than anything else. This resistance is something we must bring to it. And that is that I think in this country, over the last 20 or 30 years, we have gotten more and more estranged from each other. The political divide has become broader and deeper. And there are some communities that are only Republican or Democrat, and they only like their type in their gated community. They don't like them otherwise. But whether the community is gated or not, we have this, you're in the fold or you're out of the fold. So many times when we meet somebody, by some of the catchphrases we hear out of their mouth, we know is, oh, friend or foe. It's gone too far, in my opinion. And I push it back to the beginning of this extreme level of partisan media on both sides. This extreme level of that those people are causing all the trouble and they need to be resisted, not even dealt with. They are not our friends. They are not our neighbors. They're the destroyer of society. Both sides say that. I'm sure you've heard the other side say it. Whatever side that is. But our side's right. They are. This is infecting us with the lack of compassion and the dissatisfaction that grows out of that. And it is leading us away from happiness, and happiness is a culture. Anger held at the level of the human being can cause physical disease. Chronic physical disease and some acute physical disease. But anger held in the body, anger held by an individual harms that individual. Anger held in a family harms the family. Anger in a community does the same thing. And in a country, it is the same problem. And the Russians could not have come over here and used our social media against us if we were not vulnerable to the thought patterns that they were putting out there. They just put gas on the fire. They didn't make the fire. That's us. And the more this goes on, the weaker we'll be as a country, but also weaker we'll be as a family, weaker we'll be as individuals. This sense of otherness, I think, is the deeper layer of suffering for all of us anyway, that I'm not part of this world. And that comes from the lack of compassion and the lack of understanding that we're all in this together. So the more we emphasize we're not all in this together, the more we will have an existential suffering, whether we have physical suffering or not. So our job is to win the battle inside us, that we begin to come to the world with compassion instead of with judgment. And to not believe what we're told. I was talking with somebody at the break between the services, and he said, I think I can fix this problem. You can't, here's a new rule, you can't vote if you've watched TV in the last 60 days. I might do it, I don't know. It's a novel thought. Withdraw your judgment. You're not right. Whoever you are, you're just not right. If you can't see the other person as yourself and can't feel their pain and can't care for their happiness, then you can't have those two things yourself. You can't have this peace and you can't have happiness. So we need to be I think, the spiritual community in America, this little Tibet right here, should take up the banner. That we will see beyond the separateness and move toward wholeness in ourselves and in the community at large. And it doesn't mean that you will roll over and be a patsy. It doesn't mean that the Dalai Lama doesn't do his best to win friends and influence people to create a world in which Tibet can have its country back, or at least some autonomy. It's not that he rolls over, but he does hold compassion for the whole of it, and not just for his side. So we have lots of reasons to divide in this country, and there have been lots of wrongs, and many of them are still present with us. And I personally think Eisenhower's statement that said, beware of the military-industrial complex, has played out. And this country knows best how to send drones or people to another place to persuade them to do it our way by force. But we're losing the ability to lead the world because we're losing the ability to be a partnership inside this country. And so we treat each other and we treat the world as the enemy. And if Jesus was right, then our road to salvation is that we love our enemy and we pray for them and not the other way around. This happens at home. This happens in the neighborhood. This happens across town and across the nation. We must love our neighbors as ourselves and treat our enemy as though an honored special guest or special friend, not as the enemy. And if we do that, then I think we begin to take the high ground again. Just as when I see the Dalai Lama and he laughs and he fills a stadium with people just because he is who he is, we begin to own the energetic world of doing what Jesus said by praying for our enemies and loving them. This is the high ground. Now, about 2 years ago, a guy named Mark Siljander came here to speak. He was an ex-congressman from Michigan. And he had been in politics from a relatively young adult. And he had entered politics in rural Michigan as an evangelical Christian. Now, without casting too big a dispersion and using his own words, essentially, he was a righteous guy and thought everybody else was wrong, especially Islam. He was very down on Islam. Now, some of you guys were here when he spoke, but I talked to him then, but I also talked to him again last year in Florida, and I realized that when I'm talking to this guy that I'm really talking to somebody who exemplifies what it is to be a Christian now. Because he said, I was a hypocrite. I was believing in Jesus, but hating my enemy and disdaining the people on the other side of the aisle when I went to Washington, D.C. I despised them. And so, of course, he ran up pretty quickly through the ranks of being a Republican and was one of the inner circle at the time of Reagan and stuff. He was, one of the fast-tracked boys. Then one day after a prayer breakfast, where a Muslim spoke, and he spoke up against him, someone said, "You don't know what you're talking about. Here's the Quran, read it." So he starts to read the Quran, and in the Quran he finds 1,600 verses that are almost identical to the verses in the Bible. And when he sees that, this Christian begins to have his eyes open that the Muslims are not the enemy. Because they say that Jesus is the Messiah. They just confess that they're Messiah. That's the big thing for an evangelical, isn't it? Okay, well, so they're on board with that. Where's the problem? He started to explore that and really found that with deeper scholarship, you could see there was a bridge across these two divides. And so he began to talk with the leaders of Muslim countries, some of whom were more or less the enemy of the United States. And he actually was, through his prayer and friendship with these guys, got them to do things like bring in UN peacekeepers in Darfur. There are like 6 conflicts that he had a major hand in resolving peacefully. Now, the military-industrial complex did not like this very much. Kind of spoils the game. And the money, I suppose. So his friends, now his special friends, decided that he was a problem and they needed to get rid of him. And so they filed a bunch of charges about how he was helping terrorists and being laundering money and all this sort of stuff, all of which were false. But they said, if you don't do a plea bargain here, we probably can bury you for good and you'll never get out. So he took a year in prison. And it is my belief that on his way into prison, on his at another time, he was injected with cancer because in his hip where he got his shots, he got a childhood cancer. Only children get this cancer. Almost always fatal. And he got it. So he's in prison, and he's had success in prison already doing this prayer thing where he got like the different gangs in prison to pray together. It was kind of a miracle. And it's a very simple process. Really, I'll just tell you so you don't go away wondering. The process is that you pray with and for that guy. You break bread with them. You learn about their family. And you try to bridge the gap of understanding between you. 4 steps. Really pretty simple. Anyway, he had gangs in prison praying together, which upset the prison guards because they didn't know if they could control them if everybody was united. But anyway, that's another story. But he's lying in bed. He's lying in bed on his bunk in prison with a fatal disease growing in his body, having been stripped of all his money, all his title, being humiliated in the press. His friends turned against him. He's lying in bed and he's going, God, why me? And this is what Mark said. He said, I was lying there and I heard God speak to me, and he says, you're getting off easy. All the stuff you funded that brought so much suffering to so many people when you were a congressman, you're getting off light. Now that'll jerk a knot in you, won't it? So he did forgiveness work on all that had happened to him, that all had been taken from him, and all that had been taken from his family, and is nearly dying, and somehow he miraculously doesn't die either. He gets out of prison after 9 months. He was up here in Butner, just to drive the point home. He was up here in Butner under the high, maximum security. Like he was a big threat, this ex-congressman. Doughboy-looking fellow. You wonder how he made it through the first months of prison. I mean, he didn't look, he's a congressman. Anyway, he made it. And so now he goes around trying to bridge the gap between Muslims and Christians. That's his job. But when he walks into a room, it's been my experience, when he walks into a room, you feel a presence there. Because someone who has overcome that much through forgiveness brings a presence, in my opinion. And he is trying to be a force for good. Now, many of us have been insulted or lost a little something, or they made us wear a uniform into the ocean and roll in the sand once, and we never get over it. But here's a guy who made a life out of getting over it and doing something about it. And he's been able to do some things that others couldn't do because he loved his enemies and he prayed for them. There's a living example of a teaching that was made 2,000 years ago, both in the Dalai Lama and in Mark Siljander, and all those who are ambassadors for peace rather than for war. And that ambassadorship starts in the here, not out there. So let us do a little practice in here. So we begin by contemplation. This meditation is really a contemplation. Contemplate compassion. And essentially, let's do that by starting by asking ourselves, do we want to be happy? And the second question is, do we think our special friend wants to be happy? And see if we can find common ground there. So we feel that they want to be happy as well. And we ask ourselves, can we feel any sense of commonality with them? Are we on the same planet? Do we share the same DNA? Do we breathe the same air? Do we what? Find it. So having found it, perhaps we could call down the love of God on their head, the peace of the Christ, the blessings of goodness to them. Can we see for them that they know love, that they express love? And can we forgive? Before the service is over, we'll sing the song, May There Be. Then may it begin with me. This is it. And so it is. We're just a little more information. We're changing Super Center to just Summer Center. The school is starting a little later, and we do only meditation instead of yoga meditation and a meal for the summer. So, but I encourage y'all to join. It's a nice midweek break.